closing argument.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the board for taking the time on both hearing dates, a significant amount of time to conduct these hearings on this particular application. We thank you. Officer Hull thanks you for that. We'd like to thank you as well for, I'm sure, the extended periods of time that you had in reviewing all of the evidence that has been presented in this case. Certainly it's extensive. I would have expected all of you to certainly delve into this record in these 2 weeks since the hearing, and in addition before that time. So we would like to thank you for certainly putting that time and effort into this proceeding. As Mr. Goodlow, your attorney, says, I have an opportunity to present a closing argument on this case, and I'd like to do that. First of all, there seems to be some suggestions or misconceptions about what actually occurred in this particular case, and I'd like to somewhat address those in my closing argument, if I may. And I'd like to start from the very beginning. And the very beginning is, who was Officer Stephen Hull? And Officer Hull was an exceptional athlete, a high school football star, an individual who received a full ride scholarship to the University of Illinois to play football, a Big Ten school. He was an elite athlete. His physical fitness was at the highest extreme. He spent his lifetime up to that point in time developing his physical skills, going through that training, being able to perform at an elite level. He excelled at the University of Illinois as a football player. As a matter of fact, my understanding is he was elected one of the co-captains in his senior year and was voted all Big Ten second team as a receiver. Again, operating at an elite physical level, to the extent where he was signed to a contract by the New Orleans Saints at the NFL level. I think the statistics show that 1 in 10,000 high school athletes ever reach the level of a professional sport. But Officer Hull reached that level. Unfortunately, he was injured and could not continue down that road. This is the individual that presented to the village of Wheeling when he applied to be a police officer for the police department. And what does he do when he applies? They go through the training. They go through the evaluations. There's a physical exam by a doctor. There's an agility test that he has to pass, which clearly he did. And importantly, there was a psychological examination. And I want to point out to you, board exhibit number 13. That was a pre-employment psychological examination of Officer Hull. And it begins on, let me take you to page 685 of the record, where these evaluators, these psychologists evaluated Officer Hull as to whether or not he would be a suitable candidate for the police department and in law enforcement in general. Beginning on 685, they go through the essential job functions. And these evaluators are given a scale of problematic, marginal, acceptable, or strong. So let's go through them. So there's an essential job function of apprehending or arresting suspects. What is their assessment of Officer Hull at that time? Their evaluation, he's a strong candidate. Detect, investigate crimes, a strong candidate. Provide emergency assistance, a strong candidate. Advise, assist the public, a strong candidate. Maintain order, a strong candidate. Document activities, acceptable. Teamwork, cooperation, a strong level. respect for chain of command, strong. Professional development, strong. Prepare, present testimony, strong. And look at their summary and recommendations, and I'll read that for you. In summary, we found Mr. Hull to be a strong candidate for the Wheeling police officer position. As one can see in a review of this report, he's a man of integrity, as his father taught him to be. I'll paraphrase and go down in the next paragraph. In many ways, Mr. Hull is an ideal candidate for the position in question. We also believe he possesses good leadership potential for the future. That's the psychological evaluation performed in June of 2016, a pre-employment psychological evaluation, a strong, ideal candidate for the Village of Wheeling Police Department. What happens? Clearly, a great candidate like that, he's hired as a police officer. And how does that go? He goes to a 12-week or 10-week training program. He's elected president of his class by his classmates, passes with flying colors, comes back to the police department. He's required to go to, we believe, a 12-week training program with a FTO, a field training officer. How does that go? He meets all of the requirements and actually graduates from that field training program 4 weeks early. 4 weeks early. Is that an individual that has difficulty performing the job duties? No, that's indicative of the psychological evaluation, pre-employment. He's a strong, ideal candidate, and it proves that. After he finishes his training, what happens? He goes out and he performs his job duties as a police officer to a high level, to the extent where here is an officer on probation, his direct supervisors recommend that he apply for a special unit, a special gang enforcement unit that operates in the summer within the boundaries of the Village of Wheeling. And surprisingly, as a probationary officer, he's appointed to that special unit. Do you think that happened because he was an average police officer or a sub-average police officer? No, he was exceptional. And he actually performed to that high level, to the extent where he received commendations. And Chief Dunn testified in front of you at the prior hearing, and I'm not quoting him verbatim, but my recollection of his testimony was, at the time, he was an exceptional officer, and I believed he had the capability to sit in my chair at some point in time in the future. In other words, he was characterized as being someone who could rise through the ranks and ultimately be in a supervisory position with the police department. That's Officer Hull prior to the motor vehicle accident on September 24th of 2017. We had testimony from his wife, and we had testimony from Officer Hull. He loved this job. He was enthusiastic about it. He loved to go to work each day. He would come home and tell his wife about all of the circumstances and all the situations he was involved in. He enjoyed it. He got along with all of his superiors. He got along with all of his co-workers. This was a profession that he wanted to continue in, without a doubt. Then we have the accident on September 24th of 2017, around 9:30 in the evening. There's no dispute that this didn't happen. There's no dispute how significant the crash was. Officer Hull had to be extricated out of the vehicle by the fire department emergency personnel. And when you look at the records, you look at the ER reports, you look at the police reports and the EMS reports, there is documentation that he was in and out of consciousness after that crash. That is not disputed, although, as I will relay later, there seems to be some suggestion by Dr. Deutsch that, oh, he wasn't unconscious. Or some of these other doctors, one doctor in particular, I don't recall who it is right now, from the pension board, I think it's Dr. Massoud, the neurologist, who basically said, oh, he didn't have any trauma to his head. But clearly he did. This is a significant impact. If you look at the Lutheran General Hospital medical records, and that's board exhibit number 3, I will point out to you on page 200, there is what's called a GCS score. That stands for Glasgow Coma Scale. And that's a scale from 1 to 15. 15 meaning no problems whatsoever, full cognizant at the time. 1 meaning practically brain dead. That score is 12. And that's done by a medical expert, a physician, emergency room physician. There's also a diagram, and that diagram depicts a trauma to Officer Hull's forehead above his left eye. Again, that is a diagram specifically completed by the emergency room staff at Lutheran General Hospital. Again, the only doctor who really either refutes that or ignores it completely is Dr. Harold Deutsch. And if you read his deposition, it will clearly show that he did not recall reviewing that or overlooked it. I don't know what he did. Now, there's also seems to be a little bit of a misinterpretation. It is easily done by lay people because we're not as familiar with the medical records. Trustee McIsaac pointed out in the hearing, oh, are you aware, Officer Hull, that you tested positive for opiates? That's in the medical records. And that he pointed out, I believe, that the page on that medical record at Lutheran General Hospital was page 214. But when you review all of the medical records and you put that in context, here is the reality of that and the explanation for that. We know that Officer Hull was involved in an accident around 9:30. So let's just say hypothetically he's transported to the hospital, he gets there, they start evaluating him 10 o'clock, 10:30. You see on page 118, he's admitted to the hospital, admitted from the emergency room on September 24th at 23:56 military time. That's 11:56, 4 minutes before midnight. You'll also see down at the bottom of the page, discharge date. Officer Hull was discharged from Lutheran General Hospital the next day, September 25th, at 18:55 hours, which is 6:55 in the evening. Now, let's go to those toxicology tests on page 214 that Trustee McIsaac pointed out. If you notice, there's 2 tests that were performed. If you look at the top, they'll tell you collected date. The collected date, the first one was September 24th, 2017 at 22:26 Central Daylight Time, meaning 11:26 p.m. They collected the blood and they did the toxicology screen. What did they detect? Nothing. The next column, I'm presuming, is the column that Trustee McIsaac references. What is the date that blood workup was taken? The next day, September 25th, at what time? 13:25, which again, military time, 1:25 in the afternoon. And then we have a positive for opiates. Gee, that seems strange. But if you look at the orders prescribed by the doctors during his admission, beginning on page 172, you'll clearly see that on 9/25/17 at 4:18 a.m., 4:18 in the morning, he was given hydrocodone. You'll also see down the second paragraph after that. On September 25th at 4:41, he was given a morphine injection, 2 milligrams, IV push, during the time he was being treated. The next paragraph down there, you'll see, again, at some point in time later, 9:24 or earlier, actually, 9:24, at 23:59:28, he was given morphine, 2 milligrams and an IV push. So the explanation, if you review the medical records in detail, as you should review all of these medical records and all of this evidence, clearly this explains this positive drug test. So the suggestion that Officer Hall was under some kind of influence or was deceitful with respect to the circumstances surrounding the accident is clearly not warranted. And there's an explanation for that finding, just as there is in many of the other references made in this particular case. So we have the accident of September 24th. We have the injury to his head. We have an injury to his neck. What does he do? He seeks treatment 3 days later after the hospital. Who does he go to? He goes to Dr. Ricardo Seno. Who is Dr. Ricardo Seno? If you read his deposition and you look at his CV, it's clear who Dr. Seno is and what his qualifications are. But let's go over those. From 1998 to 2004, a period of 6 years, Dr. Seno was the medical director of the brain injury program at the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago. The Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago has now been renamed the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. And as everybody knows, if they watch TV or hear the radio, the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab has been voted for several years in a row being the #1 rehabilitation facility in the country. Dr. Seno was the medical director of the brain injury program at what is now called the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. After that, what was his position? He's the attending physician for the brain injury program at Marion Joy Rehabilitation Hospital from 2004 to 2008. Again, a highly recognized rehabilitation facility. He's the attending physician for all the brain injury program. He then becomes an independent physician at the Seno Group, and he testifies that he sees anywhere between 1,300 to 1,400 patients per year. 99% of those individuals that he sees and treats have brain injuries. That is Dr. Seno, and that is the individual, the doctor that Officer Hull went to initially three and a half days after the accident. And what does Dr. Seno do when he evaluates Officer Hull? He renders his diagnosis. Officer Hull has suffered a traumatic brain injury, moderate to severe, post-concussion syndrome, post-concussion headaches, vertigo. He recommends a number of tests and a number of different courses of treatment. Then we learn that the Village of Wheeling agrees to pay for the diagnostic test, which is an MRI of the brain and a CT scan of the brain, but that's as far as they go. We're not authorizing any further treatment, but we know that the MRI of the brain and the CT scan of the brain come back negative. But again, all of the doctors, except for 1 or 2, say, we expect that in most concussions, you don't have a finding on an MRI or a CT scan with concussions and mild traumatic brain injuries. But that doesn't change the diagnosis, and it doesn't change the recommended course of treatment. So they have Seno's reports. They have Dr. Seno's recommendations. What does the Village of Wheeling do? Nothing. Nothing. for nearly 3 months. They finally decide, well, we better send him to a doctor. And they send him to Dr. Harold Deutsch on December 8th of 2017, after Officer Hall is dealing with his continued symptoms, significant symptoms, for nearly 3 months. And let's look at Dr. Deutsch. When you read his deposition, if you haven't, what are Dr. Deutsch's qualifications with respect to brain injuries? Well, when you look at his CV, he doesn't list his specialty as being a brain injury treater. When you look at his biography that he lists on his website, does he list brain injury treatment as being an area of specialty or expertise? It does not. You look at his CV, look at his publications, look at his research that he's been involved with, his seminars that he goes to or teaches at. How many of those involve the treatment of brain injury patients? The answer, none. Dr. Deutsch has no expertise and no knowledge of brain injuries and treatment of brain injuries. But he does say, well, I think Officer Hall has a diagnosis of, he has a concussion. But I don't consider a concussion to be a traumatic brain injury. He's exaggerating his disability. But when you look at Dr. Deutsch's initial report, he performs what we call Waddell tests and Waddell signs. Waddell signs are tests to determine whether someone is faking their symptoms or exaggerating the symptoms. When you look at Dr. Deutsch's report, he does all 5 Waddell tests. All 5 are negative. Negative for exaggeration, negative for malingering. Now, what does he say? And that's on page 721 of the record. What does he say? Well, Officer Hall, he's got a concussion, but he doesn't need any further treatment. And he can go back to work light duty. Oh, by the way, on February 1st of 2018, so in about 6 weeks, he'll be perfect. He'll be 100%. He'll be able to go back to work. Why 6 weeks? When you see the question asked in his deposition, what significance do you have for February 1st? Well, everybody should recover from a concussion within 6 weeks. That's his mindset. That's someone offering an opinion that has no expertise in the treatment of brain injury patients. We have, as lay people, we see it all the time. We're concerned about our children playing sports that ultimately they could suffer concussions and the repercussions of those concussions. We see all the time football players now, concussion protocol, and those in concussion protocol or have concussions, do they recover within 6 weeks? The majority might, but are there some that don't? Absolutely. There's some that never go back to play the sport. Hockey players. Corey Crawford last year was out something like 3 or 4 months due to a concussion and post-concussion syndrome. We have all the research now prior to the NFL going through all these protocols for the chronic traumatic encephalopathy that everybody seemed to suggest that 5-10 years ago didn't exist, where the head trauma, serial head traumas to football players, does it really cause brain injury? The answer is absolutely it does. And Dr. Seno and all the doctors that treat brain injury patients confirm individuals that have concussions, especially those that have multiple concussions, will take longer to recover in subsequent concussions and could have long-lasting repercussions from those concussions. And we do have Officer Hall, unfortunately, suffering a number of concussions prior to this motor vehicle accident. And Dr. Seno and the other doctors that are aware of that and are experts in the field have opined that that certainly impacts upon his ability to recover from this most recent TBI, traumatic brain injury and concussion. Now, after the village receives Dr. Deutsch's report, what happens? Officer Hull reports back for light duty work because that's what Dr. Deutsch said and that's what the village instructed him to do. And what happens? He goes back to light duty work and dispatch in the computers. His symptoms are exacerbated by that work. We have testimony from the chief that he saw him lying on the floor, nauseous. He's taken to the emergency room at Glenbrook Hospital. And interestingly enough, the medical records from that hospital as well document that Officer Hull has nystagmus issues in his left eye at the time they do the evaluation. That is not something that can be controlled by an individual. It's something that is objective, an objective finding by a doctor, and that is documented in the Glenbrook Hospital emergency room records. Now, if the village takes the position, we're relying on Dr. Deutsch's report and Dr. Deutsch's opinions. And Dr. Deutsch's opinion was, well, Officer Hull will be 100% fit for duty as of February 1st of 2018. Did the village order Officer Hull back to work full duty on February 1st, 2018? No. Did they order him back to work in March, in April, in May, in June, July, August? No. Do we have any documentation where the village, relying on Dr. Deutsch's opinion, offered Officer Hull or ordered Officer Hull back to work full duty at any time after February 1st, 2018? We do not. Because they didn't. They're picking and choosing what parts of Dr. Deutsch's opinions they're going to accept. Now, the village is still denying treatment. Dr. Seno is recommending courses of treatment. What does Officer Hull do? On his own, from his own pocket, he goes and has the neuropsychological evaluation that Dr. Seno recommended initially in the first visit with the Dr. Guidati Brighting, that's board exhibit number 14. She evaluated Officer Hull over 2 days on February 7th and February 8th of 2018. What does she find? She finds that Officer Hull is suffering from adjustment disorder, mixed anxiety with depressed mood, and she offers an opinion. It is imperative that Officer Hull receive additional treatment, and she outlines that recommended course of treatment on page 700. She then offers additional testimony in her deposition, and I'm hoping that all of you have read that deposition. In the battery of tests that she performs on Officer Hull, inherently in those tests are scales to determine if an individual is exaggerating or malingering the symptoms that they're complaining of. All of those tests were negative, and the Dr. Guidati Brighting testified in no uncertain terms that Officer Hull was not malingering, he was not exaggerating, and that his current condition and symptoms were caused by the motor vehicle accident of September 24th of 2017. That report was provided to the village, and what did they do? Nothing. Nothing. We have two doctors that say Officer Hull needs treatment, that he suffered a traumatic brain injury, has other issues, both with depression, dealing with those symptoms, both physical and psychological, and they refuse to do anything. Finally, after nothing happening, nothing being approved, the village doing absolutely nothing, Officer Hull then uses his group health insurance to go out, and that's an HMO. He has to go to a primary care physician that he's never had before. Again, because he'd never been hurt before, never had problems where he needed to see a doctor necessarily on a regular basis, performing at an elite physical level. He had to find a primary care physician, schedule that, and ultimately got in to see Dr. Weiss on August 1st of 2018. Again, nearly a year after the accident, 11 months after the accident, with no treatment. And Dr. Weiss, what does she find? And what is her diagnosis? Post-Concussion Syndrome, depression, referred Officer Hull to Dr. Sherman, a neurologist. He sees Dr. Sherman on August 30th of 2018. Dr. Sherman offers a diagnosis of concussion, psychological issues, recommends vestibular therapy for his eye condition, counseling, and medication. And Officer Hull begins to at least try to schedule and go forward with that treatment through his HMO, his group health insurance carrier. Now, what does the village do? They go and get a supplemental report from Dr. Deutsch. They don't even have Officer Hull reevaluated in person. They just send 2 sets of medical records to Dr. Deutsch. The Glenbrook Hospital emergency room records and Dr. Godotti Breiting's report. And Dr. Deutsch then offers an addendum report where he provides opinions. But take a look at that report. Take a look at the opinions that Dr. Deutsch claims is his interpretation of Dr. Breiting's opinions. I don't think he's reading the same report. He seems to suggest that Dr. Breiting is saying that Officer Hull's condition, psychological condition, is in no way related to the motor vehicle accident, which is clearly incorrect and in opposite of the written report and the opinions of Dr. Breiting. What does the village do after they get Dr. Deutsch's addendum report without ever reevaluating Officer Hull? What do? Take a look at board exhibit number 27, page 861. They send Officer Hull a letter. We're terminating all of your benefits. We're not paying for any treatment based on Dr. Deutsch's report. That's what the village does. What's the next step in this chronology? Well, the chief or the village, I don't know who makes ultimately the decision. They say, well, since we haven't evaluated Officer Hull in a year, maybe we need to have him reevaluated. So what do? They send him a letter. They say, we want you evaluated by our chosen psychologists for a fitness for duty evaluation. And here's the doctor or doctors that are going to perform your fitness for duty evaluation. Dr. Haneke, evaluates Officer Hall on September 24th of 2018, 1 year after the accident. Board Exhibit 15. The department and the village's own doctor. How did that evaluation go? What were the results of that evaluation? What were the opinions of Dr. Huneke? Well, you can read the report and you can read his deposition testimony. He is clear. Officer Hall has a diagnosis of an adjustment disorder with mixed anxiety. He has depression. He has somatic symptom disorder. And all of those conditions are related to the motor vehicle accident of September 24th of 2017. What else does he offer as an opinion? Officer Hall needs further medical treatment. He needs psychological treatment, counseling, psychiatry. He needs all this treatment. And he's not malingering or exaggerating at all. Matter of fact, he's downplaying his symptoms to some degree. And what is his final opinion with respect to whether Officer Hall is capable of returning to work, a fitness for duty evaluation? He is not fit for any type of work, not even light duty work, until he receives the appropriate recommended courses of treatment. Again, September of 2018, no work of any kind. What does the village do? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. A few months go by, and what happens? The village and the chief send a letter to Officer Hall. We want to meet with you because we want to have a discussion about whether or not there's some reasonable accommodations the village and the department can make for you to come back to work as a police officer. But remember, at this point in time, their most recent doctor evaluator, Dr. Huneke, is saying no work whatsoever of any kind until he gets the recommended treatment. We have this meeting, this discussion, where Officer Hall appeared by himself, and there were a number of representatives from the village and the chief at that meeting. And according to Officer Hall, he testifies that they asked him, well, is there any accommodation that we can make, you being a police officer, so that you can come back to work in some capacity? What accommodations can be made in a police officer's position? I can't drive. Does that mean then I'll have a driver when we go out on patrol? I'm having dizziness and nausea. What's the accommodation? Are you still comfortable with carrying your weapon, driving at high rates of speed, operating the computer at the same time you're responding to calls on your radio, watching for criminal activity? What accommodations can be made? What kind of changes to the essential functions of the job duties of a police officer can be made to accommodate the continued symptoms and limitations experienced by Officer Hall in September, October, November of 2018 that have been with him for over a year? There aren't any accommodations. Now, the chief testified, well, we would have offered him any job in the village of Wheeling as an accommodation. Well, if that were true, where's the letter confirming that? You would think that they were smart enough, since the village attorney was there and the chief was there and the representatives from the village were there, and they wanted to confirm that they made that type of offer to Officer Hall. Oh, we'll give you any kind of job. Just let us know what you can do. Where's the confirmation of that discussion? We have no letter, no documentation from the village that they were willing to accommodate. But we do have a letter later on in January to the Board of Fire and Police Commission, moving to terminate Officer Hall. In one of that letters, it states the reason for termination is he's been off work for extended period of time. There are no accommodations, or he's unable to perform the essential functions of the job, and he can't provide us with information as to when he can come back and perform the full unrestricted job duties of a police officer. So we're moving for his termination. The reason why he can't give that information is he had no treatment at that point in time offered by the village, other than going through his group carrier, seeing a neurologist, getting some medication, starting some vestibular therapy, but no counseling, no psychology, nothing. And no doctor had released him to return to work at this particular time, other than Dr. Deutsch back in December of 2017 saying, well, he'll be fine on February 1st of 2018. So what happens? Officer Hull is terminated from the police department. And one of the reasons the chief gives is because he wasn't truthful in advising us that he was volunteering or offering his assistance, I'll say that, because there is some dispute, to the football team, Cary Grove football team, in the summer of 2018. But again, I would point out to you that the actual form that Officer Hull filled out initially, prior to being allowed to volunteer for that football team, there's a form. He checked the box volunteer. He did not want to be paid, didn't expect to be paid, and wasn't paid until after the summer session was completely over. Now, the chief testifies that, well, he needed to get permission in order to volunteer. Well, I can tell you, I reviewed the most recent policy order on secondary employment with the Village of Wheeling, and it specifically excludes voluntary activities. You do not have to get permission to voluntarily offer your time. It's ridiculous to think that this department requires their officers who may assist their children in Little League or soccer or whatever else, that they have to get permission from the department to volunteer to coach their children or to offer their services. There's programs like Cop on Top or some of these other volunteer positions that officers do. It's ludicrous to believe they have to get permission from the department to participate in those activities. And Officer Hall was unaware of that because it wasn't the policy. He was volunteering. Even though the village is not assisting him, he's trying to get treatment through his group health insurance carrier, and he's doing the best he can. And ultimately, he does show some improvement, and he attempts to return to work, and he obtains a records clerk job for the village of South Barrington, and he's able to perform that job for nearly a year. But again, he testified, and the records document this as well, that they made accommodations for him. He was able to get up and take breaks frequently. He utilized all his benefit time, sick days, vacation time, comp time to take days off work when his symptoms had worsened. And ultimately, they did worsen in the summer of 2019. They worsened to the extent where he was contemplating ending his life and ultimately had to be inpatient at Alexian Brothers Behavioral Health. Again, Village has never offered any assistance in that matter or in that treatment as well. After applying for this pension through this board, we have the various board doctors evaluating Officer Hull, and let's go through those very briefly. We have 3 neurologists evaluating Officer Hull. The first neurologist, Dr. Jeffrey Kramer. What's Dr. Kramer's opinion? Officer Hull's disabled. He has a traumatic brain injury and post-concussion syndrome with persistent vestibular impairment and headaches. The diagnosis and his symptoms are all caused and emanate from the September 24th, 2017 motor vehicle accident. We have Dr. Neil Allen, the neurologist, another neurologist. He offers an opinion. I can only offer my neurological opinion that Officer Hull is not disabled neurologically, but he needs to get treatment. He needs to get treatment for the vestibular dysfunction. It seems to me a little inconsistent. If he says he's not disabled, yet he needs treatment for vestibular dysfunction, how can he operate a motor vehicle? How can he drive at high speeds? How can he operate the computer and at the same time that he's operating a motor vehicle if he has vestibular issues and he's suffering from dizziness and nausea? We have Dr. Leslie Massoud as the neurologist, the third neurologist. His opinion, Officer Hull's not disabled neurologically. But if you read his report, he says, and I base that upon the fact that he did not have any type of a traumatic head injury. Again, what records are Dr. Massoud looking at? If you look at the Lutheran General Hospital records from the day of the accident, you would clearly see that the doctor noted trauma to Officer Hull's left forehead above his eye and documented that he had a 12 Gcs score. Dr. Massoud also says, well, he's discharged from the hospital without any kind of pain. That's what I'm relying on to say he's not neurologically disabled. Again, I don't think he read the medical records from Lutheran General Hospital because those records clearly are contrary to those opinions. Now, we have 3 psychiatrists that evaluated Officer Hull for his psychological condition. Dr. Robert Reff, what is his opinion? Officer Hull is disabled due to major depression. He could return to work after a treatment program is completed, possibly, and the September 24, 2017 motor vehicle accident is the contributing cause of the disability. We have Dr. Brian McFall, another psychiatrist. What is his opinion? Officer Hull is disabled. He has post-traumatic stress disorder, major depressive disorder, somatic symptom disorder, anxiety disorder. His disability is related to the September 24th, 2017 motor vehicle accident. And then we have the third psychiatrist, Dr. Stephen Dinwiddie, who offers an opinion. I believe Officer Hull is disabled due to major depressive disorder. But that major depressive disorder is not related to the motor vehicle accident because he didn't have depression until he was terminated. And so his disability is a result of his depression caused by his termination from the job. Well, let's think this through a little bit. Number one, first of all, one of the reasons why Officer Hull was terminated, because he couldn't go back to work and perform the essential job duties required of a police officer, and the village did not want to keep his position open any longer after extending his probationary period for an additional year. So the reason for his termination, the cause for his termination is he could not perform the job duties as a result of his symptoms emanating from the motor vehicle accident. Dr. Dinwiddie says the termination is the cause of his depressive disorder. So, in my opinion, what caused the depressive disorder were the symptoms emanating from the auto accident. Now, is Dr. Dinwiddie correct that he didn't have depression symptoms prior to his termination? Well, again, let's take a look at the medical records and all the reports. Dr. Brighting in February of 2018, almost a year before Officer Hall was terminated. What's her diagnosis? Depression. He needs treatment. Dr. Weiss in August of 2018, the GP, she performed what's called a PHQ, a personal health questionnaire. And that is a screening test for depression. He scored a 9, which is categorized as mild depression. On August 1st, he scored an 8. On August 22nd, he scored a 7. On October 1st of 2018, he scored another 7, which is major depression, and she prescribed medication, clearly long before the termination. Then we have their own fitness for duty evaluator, Dr. Hunnicky, who performed the evaluation. And that's the doctor chosen by the village. What does he say? Officer Hall has mild to moderate depressive symptoms related to the motor vehicle accident. That's on page 6 of his report. That's in September of 2018, 3 months prior to Officer Hall's termination. We have the counselor, Lori Jendrika, in October. She has him fill out questionnaires regarding, have you experienced any of these symptoms in the last 6 months? And he fills this out, and there's a diagnosis of major depressive disorder, recurrent moderate, according to that doctor. And again, that is the chronology of events that we have leading up to today. Now, as Mr. Goodlow will relate to you, I'm sure in executive session, we have the burden of proving our case, and there's certain elements that we have to prove in order to be entitled to be awarded or receive a line of duty disability pension benefit. I want to go through those briefly with you. And if I'm incorrect, I'm sure Mr. Goodlow will correct me. I believe that there are 3 elements that we need to prove in order to be awarded a line of duty disability pension benefit. Number 1 is the applicant must be a full-time police officer. Again, I believe the evidence is unrefuted with that particular element. On September 24th, Officer Hull was a full-time sworn police officer for the village of Wheeling. At the time he filed his application with this board, he was a full-time sworn police officer. So we've met that first element. The second element we need to prove is that the applicant must have suffered an injury that physically or mentally disables him from service in the police department so as to render necessary his suspension or retirement from police service. Again, I believe, or it is our position, that the evidence supports that and proves that element as well. We have multiple doctors and multiple psychiatrists, multiple psychologists offering their opinions that Officer Hall is suffering from a traumatic brain injury, from mild to moderate, post-concussion syndrome, vestibular impairment, headaches, major depressive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorder, somatic symptom disorder. We have all the doctors but one, stating that Officer Hall is disabled as a result of these conditions. And the only doctor that says he is not disabled is Dr. Deutsch. The third element we have to prove is that the disabling condition must have incurred in or resulted from the performance of an act of duty. And I believe that we have proven that as well. Clearly, Officer Hull was performing at an exceptional level as a police officer prior to the motor vehicle accident of September 24th of 2017. He then suffers a significant head injury, a traumatic brain injury in that accident. That is the initiating incident that led to the development of his psychological condition as well. And he continues to experience those symptoms up to the present time. We have opinions from multiple doctors that these conditions and symptoms were caused or emanated from a motor vehicle accident. And certainly that motor vehicle accident is an act of duty that is unique to a police officer. He was on patrol in an unmarked squad car, full uniform and equipment, when he was struck by a drunk driver. Now, there are cases as well, and I want to point out to the board that we do not have the requirement to prove that the disabling condition was, or the sole cause of the disabling condition was the motor vehicle accident of September 24th, 2017. We only need to show that the accident or the injury or the incident was a contributing cause to the disability. In other words, there could be multiple causes, but if the act of duty and the incident was one of the contributing causes, doesn't have to be the primary cause, the sole cause, but one of the contributing causes to the disability, then that individual is entitled to a line of duty disability pension benefit. And I quote the Supreme Court case of Wade versus North Chicago Police Pension Fund, and then an appellate court case of Rose versus Mount Prospect Police Pension Fund, where those courts have stated you need only show that the accident or the incident was a contributing cause leading to the disability. And there has been no evidence in this case presented by anyone that Officer Hull's disabling condition was caused by anything other than the repercussions from the motor vehicle accident on September 24th of 2017. And we would ask you to award him the line of duty disability pension. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. As your client has the burden of proof, you'll be given a brief period for rebuttal. Is the village ready, or do we need to take a short break? We've been going about an hour, so does anybody need a break?
Whatever the members would prefer, we're fine either way.
Okay, go ahead.
Great, thank you. You have heard a lot today from Mr. Hull as to how he feels he is disabled. You heard a lot a couple weeks ago as well. How he feels he cannot perform the job duties of a police officer for the Village of Wheeling. You have heard from his wife and his parents as to their observations of his current condition. You have heard from his counsel's arguments as to how Mr. Hull deserves to receive a duty-related disability pension due to his injuries and current condition. And you've heard about all of the actions of the village in response to Mr. Hull's immediately litigated claim. But we're not here today to discuss how the village defended a claim. To argue that this is the subject of this matter is an attempt to detract from the real issues here. And what you haven't heard today in person is from the medical professionals, now numbering in the double digits, who have examined Mr. Hull since his accident. But you have their records and some of their depositions. The record is quite broad in this matter, and the medical experts, some of which were chosen by Mr. Hull himself, do not agree that Mr. Hull's current condition is a result of his motor vehicle accident. It's not even close. 3 days after Mr. Hall was released from the hospital, he visited Dr. Ricardo Seno, a physiatrist, who performed an examination of him. Now, Dr. Seno was not Mr. Hall's primary care physician, nor was he referred to Dr. Seno from the hospital. He was referred by his attorney at the time. Dr. Seno provided no less than 13 additional doctor and diagnostic referrals, identifying separate areas of concern for Mr. Hall. Now, interesting to note is that Dr. Seno referred Mr. Hall to Dr. DiDomenico, a psychologist with which he is affiliated. But Mr. Hall did not visit that doctor, not with his own insurance, not with any insurance. He did not visit a psychologist or a psychiatrist for nearly a year later. Dr. Seno diagnosed Mr. Hall with a moderate to severe TBI, despite no diagnostic test finding any remnant of the physical characteristics of this level of injury. The barrage of diagnostic tests had already been performed just days earlier at the hospital. CTs and MRIs of his head and back, and all came back negative. The second round of tests, which the village did authorize, revealed the same exact result. There were even more tests performed on order of Dr. Seno than the hospital ordered. But the test revealed no findings of any physical, head, neck, or back injury. Now, counsel says that the doctors agree that a mild TBI would not show up on a CT or an MRI, any diagnostic test. But what's ignored is the fact that Dr. Seno is pushing the theory of a moderate to severe TBI, completely different than a mild TBI or concussion. But the attorney's referral to Dr. Seno at that time appears to have set up this litigation and the pending workers' compensation claim. And 13 doctors at the time were ready to keep this going. But just 6 days after this visit to Dr. Seno, Mr. Hall did something else. He filed a workers' compensation claim for the accident. He was receiving full pay for the time off under PETA. That much is clear. But nonetheless, the claim was filed. A nurse case manager was assigned to Mr. Hall's claim, and as Dr. Seno's treatment notes show throughout, minimal information was discussed in front of her. What was Mr. Hall or Dr. Seno trying to conceal? Throughout this matter, in his testimony and his arguments today, Mr. Hall has tried to shift the focus of what he needs to prove to obtain a finding of disability to an all-out attack on the village and its denial of his claim of injury. But the focus is now on him and what he did, and more importantly, did not do. He testified numerous times how he did not want to violate protocol in seeking his own treatment when his treatment referrals were denied through workers' compensation, and even when his own chief told him to get the treatment he needed through his own insurance. If it is true that every single doctor he contacted refused to treat him, as he wants you to believe, because he claimed the conditions were a result of a work injury, are we to believe that every person whose claim is denied by workers' compensation is forced to suffer and not receive treatment, even when they have insurance through their employer? This doesn't sound like a person who is trying to get better. It sounds like someone who's trying to litigate their claim. The medical experts have thoroughly reviewed Mr. Hall's condition over the past 3.5 years, and their findings are a clear picture that Mr. Hall is not disabled as he leads you to believe. Some of the best opinions, as you will see, are from Mr. Hall's own doctors. Dr. Guadati Bredding, Mr. Hall's examining neuropsychologist, examined him in early February 2018 on a referral from his own attorney. She said in no uncertain terms on page 699 of the board's Exhibit 14 that once Officer Hall receives treatment for his adjustment disorder and ADHD, the cognitive difficulties should improve, and it is expected that he will be able to return to work. She went on to note that Officer Hall and his family can rest assured that there is no evidence of permanent cognitive changes related to the injury, and that he is not experiencing cognitive changes related to the mild TBI, as those difficulties would have resolved by now. This was 4.5 months after the accident. On page 695, she notes that Mr. Hall denied feeling depressed. Instead, he is upset at the possibility that his second career has ended. On the self-reporting form that Dr. Bretting had Mr. Hull complete related to common symptoms after a concussion, Mr. Hull checked the boxes for all 16 symptoms, every single one, and even wrote in some additional symptoms. Interesting to note is that he checked the box for dizziness as moderate to severe. This is the same symptom, as I will discuss in a moment, he told the village's examining neurologist, Dr. Deutsch, 2 months prior had subsided. Dr. Bretting noted on page 700 of Board Exhibit 17 that Officer Hull can be reassured that the trajectory of his concussion and emotional injury from the motor vehicle accident will continue to improve over time. She recommended that he engage in a social lifestyle and questioned Dr. Seno's limitation on driving. Now remember, Mr. Hull's light-duty assignment remained available at the village of Wheeling, but his doctor, Dr. Seno, told him he couldn't drive. How can you work if you won't show up? In her deposition on page 56 of applicant's exhibit number 2, Dr. Bretting firmed up her position that Mr. Hull suffered a mild TBI, pointing to his scores on the Glasgow Coma Scale and the immediacy to which he returned to his baseline abilities under that testing, just a few short hours after the accident. The council discussed a score of 12 on the GCS. That's right on the cusp of mild TBI, just 1 point off. And a few hours later, he returned to normal. This wasn't a lasting condition, certainly not a lasting result on the GCS. On page 81 of that same deposition, Dr. Bretting agreed that Mr. Hull was not permanently disabled from a neuropsychological standpoint. On page 87, she noted that Mr. Hull's intellectual functioning and academic functioning had remained unchanged from his prior accidents, prior examinations well before the accident. And on page 698 of her report, in Exhibit 14, she indicates, and I will read directly from the report. At the bottom of 698, paragraph 2, halfway through, Officer Hull's overall cognitive effort was generally valid on standalone performance and embedded validity measures. However, there were 2 instances of questionable effort. This suggests that his effort and engagement in testing may have varied, and results should be interpreted with some caution. Now, Dr. Bretting is innately aware of the care of patients who have suffered multiple concussions in the past. There is no doubt. You'll see from her CV that she serves as a team doctor to professional sports teams in the Chicagoland area, and she screens patients for concussions on a regular basis. Now, her opinion that Mr. Hull's cognitive complaints are not related to his mild TBI are therefore well-founded based on her experience. Remember, this is Mr. Hull's own doctor. Dr. Sherman, Mr. Hull's neurologist, stated during his deposition on page 41 of the applicant's exhibit number 3, that Mr. Hull experienced a mild TBI, not a moderate to severe TBI, as psychiatrist Dr. Seno noted. He noted that he agreed with Dr. Deutsch, the village's examining neurologist, on his opinions regarding Mr. Hull's continued symptoms due to his psychological and emotional concerns, rather than an unresolved mild TBI. The only thing he did disagree with Dr. Deutsch was his opinion that Mr. Hull could return to work. But Dr. Deutsch was very clear that his opinion on Mr. Hull returning to work was from a neurological standpoint, while Dr. Bretting had him off work pending psychological care, which he still had not sought on his own in mid-summer 2018. Dr. Sherman, the neurologist, did not make that distinction, and he even admitted in his deposition that while Mr. Hull came to visit him initially, he was already off work on the orders of Dr. Seno that he didn't have the right to overrule. Therefore, the decision to keep him off work had already been made. On page 42 of Dr. Sherman's deposition, he admitted that while Mr. Hull complained of headaches, nausea, and dizziness, he personally never observed any outward signs of these complaints, and that he ambulated properly around his examination room, which could preclude a manifestation of dizziness. He further noted on page 45 of his deposition that the duloxetine that Mr. Hull was taking could cause nystagmus, or an involuntary movement of the eyes, in addition to the gabapentin that he was taking that could cause dizziness, mental cloudiness, and tiredness. He noted that he only once observed these involuntary eye movements in Mr. Hull, and they were mild. Dr. Deutsch, the village's independent medical examiner, a neurologist, examined Mr. Hull in December of 2017, a few months after the accident, actually a little bit less than that. His IME report is board exhibit number 16. His neurological exam is completely normal, and so was his physical exam. He saw no evidence of nystagmus, and in fact, all of his examinations were completely normal. And the issues that Mr. Hull described, headaches, like noise sensitivity, irritability, anxiety, were entirely somatic, and no doctor could measure their accuracy or intensity. Interestingly enough, Mr. Hull noted that he was previously getting dizzy and nauseous, but those symptoms resolved in the beginning of December of 2017. Remember, this is 3 months after the accident, and Mr. Hull himself told Dr. Deutsch, a doctor who he knew was retained by the village to independently examine him, that his dizziness and nausea had resolved. Now, his testimony a couple weeks ago is the opposite, but the report was in evidence first. And no questions based on that inconsistency were placed to Dr. Deutsch at his deposition, you will note. Now, the same symptoms that Mr. Hull later complained of to Dr. Seno, strike that. Dr. Deutsch further noted that Mr. Hull sustained a mild TBI, a diagnosis that every single doctor agrees with other than Dr. Seno. He noted that Mr. Hull's prior concussions had no relation to the concussion he received in the motor vehicle accident. Mr. Hull testified a couple weeks ago in this very room that his prior concussions, of which he said he had a few, mind you, Dr. Seno noted a number, he was fine a couple days later, a few days later, but yet he wants you to believe today there's a culmination effect. No, Dr. Deutsch said that he would not recommend any further neurological treatment. He said that Mr. Hull should be back to work by February 2018 as his symptoms from the TBI had subsided, and that he could return to work immediately in a light-duty capacity, which he was then offered. He placed Mr. Hull at MMI about 2 months after the examination, which was conveniently a few days before the same time Mr. Hull was referred to by his attorney to Dr. Bredding for her neuropsychological opinion, when he told her that his symptoms had reappeared. After receiving Dr. Bredding's report, the village asked Dr. Deutsch to review the report, and he agreed with Dr. Bredding that any of Mr. Hull's limitations were as a result of his adjustment order and ADHD, neither of which were a result of his TBI from the motor vehicle accident, but from his termination. Now, Mr. Hull's position is that Dr. Deutsch is a fraud, in no uncertain terms, and that he lied in his report. Well, you have Dr. Deutsch's deposition transcript. You have a record of the questions that were asked and the answers that were given. And conveniently, there's no discussion of these inconsistencies or this position here. So moving on to the board's examining doctors. In short, Dr. Allen, the board's first examining neurologist, on page 1048 of Board Exhibit 31, notes that Mr. Hull's diagnoses of vestibular dysfunction and post-concussive syndrome cannot be related to his motor vehicle accident, as they should have resolved within months of the accident, similar to what both Dr. Deutsch and Dr. Bredding have opined. His neurological examination of Mr. Hull was normal. He goes on to note that Mr. Hull showed significant signs of symptom magnification during his physical examination, most involving the doctor's examination of his eyes for evidence of nystagmus and other vestibular symptoms. Now remember, Dr. Deutsch did not observe any nystagmus in Mr. Hull, nor did Dr. Bredding. Dr. Sherman only observed it very mildly and admitted that the duloxetine could have caused nystagmus. In the end, Dr. Allen does not believe that Mr. Hull suffers from a disabling neurological condition. Dr. Massoud, the board's second examining neurologist, on page 1078 of Board Exhibit 32, notes that Mr. Hull suffers from a chronic migraine disorder unrelated to the motor vehicle accident. He also noted that while Mr. Hull may have benign positional paroxysmal vertigo, unrelated to the accident as well, it would not preclude him from performing the duties of a police officer. His neurological examination of Mr. Hull was normal. Dr. Massoud does not believe that Mr. Hull suffers from a disabling neurological condition. Dr. Kramer, the board's third examining neurologist, despite opining that Mr. Hull is disabled from a neurological standpoint, noted on page 1025 of Board Exhibit 30 that Mr. Hull exhibited some exaggerated eye movements in his examination, which is consistent with Dr. Allen's examination. His neurological examination was otherwise unremarkable, as has been the case in the past. Recall, Dr. Deutsch, just 3 months after the accident, found no abnormalities with Mr. Hull's eye movements, nor did Dr. Bredding or Dr. Allen. Dr. Sherman observed it mildly. This now marks 5 neurologists and 1 neuropsychologist who did not observe involuntary eye movements in Mr. Hull, and 1 just mildly. And a handful of doctors who believe that he may be magnifying his symptoms. You may find that Dr. Kramer's report is quite brief, which is further explained in his response that he spent an hour and a half reviewing the records and only a half hour preparing the report. It's a stark difference from the other examining doctors. Dr. Reff, the first examining psychiatrist, noted on page 1100 of Board Exhibit 33 that he did not believe the accident was the proximate cause of Mr. Hull's disability. He noted that Mr. Hull's psychiatric condition was related to his termination from the village, not the motor vehicle accident. This is the same opinion shared by Dr. Bredding and, as you will note, the 2 other board psychiatrists. Dr. Dinwiddie, the board's second examining psychiatrist, stated on page 1125 of Board Exhibit 34 that despite Mr. Hull's symptoms of major depressive disorder, his psychiatric symptoms were not present until at least a year after the accident, making a causal connection unlikely. Dr. Dinwiddie goes on further on the next page to note that to the extent that the stressors of Mr. Hull's onset of depressive episode can be identified, they appear to be related to his job termination. Again, in agreement with some of the other doctors. Dr. McFall, the final examining psychiatrist, despite opining that Mr. Hull is disabled from a psychiatric standpoint and has PTSD, noted on page 1161 that of Board Exhibit 35 that Mr. Hull suffers from panic attacks brought on by large crowds or open areas. However, Dr. McFall makes no mention in his report that Mr. Hull contradicted both of these fears when he sat on the sidelines at a high school football state championship in front of a very large crowd in a large stadium with hundreds of potentially thousands of people. However, he does go on to note on page 1162 that, as the other medical professionals have indicated, Mr. Hull's psychiatric conditions do not appear to be related to his mild TBI. Despite Dr. McFall noting that Mr. Hull could not even work in a light-duty capacity, Mr. Hull began work at his new job in South Barrington as a records clerk in a police station just a couple months later. Now, the massive weight of the evidence here is in favor of Mr. Hull not being disabled in any manner. You as a board have the ability to discard whatever medical report you do not feel to be credible. As I noted before, Dr. Kramer's neurological opinion that noted Mr. Hull is disabled is based on a completely normal neurological examination with some signs of symptom exaggeration. The contradictory opinions in the report and Dr. Kramer's own acknowledgement that he spent an hour and a half reviewing the records and 30 minutes preparing the report is enough for the board to discount this opinion and disregard it entirely. Now, counsel says today that this chronology of events this is the chronology of events leading up to today, but it's untrue. There's a lot more that happened since the board exams in 2019. Where are Mr. Hull's current treatment records since that time? This is his burden, not the village's. This is his application. And strangely, they're missing. Yes, Mr. Hull is not serving as a police officer for the village anymore, but we have to look at the accomplishments he has performed and continues to perform since the accident. He served as an assistant coach of the offensive line of a high school football team to a state championship in an arena with hundreds, if not thousands of fans present, in a high-stress situation requiring split-second decisions. That game was just over a year after the accident. Just a few days after that game, Mr. Hull sat in a room with Chief Dunn as you heard, and told him point blank that he suffers from headaches on a daily basis, he was unable to exercise, and while he tries to keep some sort of social life, aside from walking his dog around the neighborhood, he mostly just stays in his house all day. When asked what, if any, accommodations might enable him to perform his job duties or any other job at the Village of Wheeling, he said there were none. And he was not interested in working in any other position for the village. None, not a single thing could the village do to help him complete a job that multiple doctors already said he could do without accommodations. Now, counsel's argument today that there is no letter memorializing the offer is misdirection. Mr. Hull said he couldn't work any job at the village. What is the purpose of a letter to offer him the job when he already said no? Yes, Mr. Hull was terminated from the village, but that is not why we're here today. And it was made very clear that his termination was based on his failure to abide by departmental policy, very clearly spelled out when he accepted employment for the village. That during a period in which he was receiving PETA benefits of full pay, he shall have no other employment, whether paid or unpaid. You heard Chief Dunn's testimony on this subject. And again, an indication of the departmental policy today is another act of misdirection. The Public Employee Disability Act is very clear to this point. At 5 ILCS 345, Section D, it says, quote, during this period of disability, the injured person shall not be employed in any other manner, with or without monetary compensation. Any person who is employed in violation of this paragraph forfeits the continuing compensation provided by this act from the time such employment begins. This was a PETA violation, clear and simple. And that's the reason for the termination. Now, further on in this section, it indicates that any compensation received by that employee must be returned to the entity that provided it. That didn't happen here. This doesn't sound like an employer who is out to get a police officer who filed a disability claim. It sounds like a gift. Now, the termination is based on what the record shows, not the reason that has been argued today based on speculation. But again, it's not why we're here today. As was noted before, all of the boards examining psychiatrists have indicated that the termination is the reason for the psychiatric condition, not the motor vehicle accident. If the board were to grant a duty-related disability pension to every applicant that was terminated by the department and suffered depression as a result of it, you'd be meeting here with much more frequency. Where would the line be drawn? Think for a moment how it would play out. But for an applicant's initial accident, he's off work for the village, he wouldn't have gone out and made a voluntary decision to seek other employment, violating department policy, potentially violating PETA, which results in him getting fired. And he develops depression and it hampers his recovery. What is the intervening cause here that is fueling the psychological issues? The applicant's voluntary decision that got him terminated. It's not a basis for granting a pension award. Not that we needed another contradiction between Mr. Hull's complaints to his doctors and his actions in daily life, but what happened next continued to degrade his credibility. After Mr. Hull looked Chief Dunn in the face and told him that he was uninterested in working in any capacity for the village, despite coaching a football team to a state title 5 days before, he applied for and took a job as a records clerk in the police department in South Barrington in late 2019, about a year later. This is a similar position that was offered to him as an accommodation in Wheeling. It's the very same type of position that he indicated he could not perform a year prior due to his symptoms. The very same symptoms, he says, up to today he continues to have. And as you heard Chief Dunn testify, this job was even more demanding than the ones offered to him at the Wheeling Police Department in the records division. He worked at that job for nearly a year until quitting just a couple months ago, with no clear reason why until we heard a couple weeks ago. Convenient timing, you may say, a return of symptoms that he says were not present for the last year, preventing him from performing those job duties. A job with no request for accommodations in writing, and no evidence in the record from any individual to testify to accommodations. It says the symptoms turned back on like someone flipped a switch when they were convenient. Does this pattern start to look familiar? But it's not the job that he took that flies in the face of his complaints to his doctors. It's the manner in which he applied for the job, the words he used on the application. Refer to page 206 of Village Exhibit number 3. There, Mr. Hull stated in his application to South Barrington, in his own words, that he was able to handle any task that's presented to him and focus on every detail that's required for the job to be completed promptly and appropriately. He also states that he is able to transition into the role of records clerk very seamlessly. Finally, he noted, although I cannot physically serve and protect in the field, I'm still mentally capable of contributing. Mentally capable of contributing. I'm able to handle any task that is presented to me and focus on every detail that's required for the job to be completed promptly and appropriately. What is absent from this application is his mention of mental impairments, constant headaches, dizziness, nausea, inability to exercise, fear of crowds, and inability to leave his home. All the things he told Chief Dunn would prevent him from doing the same work at Wheeling. Again, the same pattern manifests itself. Which are we to assume? That the statements he made on the application were false, as he'd lead you believe, he just wanted to do everything he needed to do to get the job, or were the statements that he made to Chief Dunn false? Either way, his credibility is lost. Today, Mr. Hull, or 2 weeks ago, Mr. Hull stated that at his South Barrington job, he was given several accommodations to perform his work duties. But again, are we to take his word on this? The burden is his to overcome, and as we've pointed out thus far, his word is not credible. His timesheets show no multiple extended breaks from his job duties. They show straight time, no days off, minimal sick days, some of which were not because he was sick, but because of a family member or child. No special office away from the hustle and bustle of a police station. In fact, he worked at the front desk at times. No limited hours. In fact, his timesheets show that in the last year, his schedule changed quite a bit, likely to account for a reduction in staff at the police station to limit in-person interactions due to COVID. And yet he showed up for work during these modified shifts. What's also missing from Mr. Hull's personnel file from South Barrington, which is in the record, is any mention of his condition, any request for accommodation, any explanation as to why he left employment there. No witness is here today or a couple weeks ago to say that Mr. Hull requested any accommodations other than himself, and certainly he did not ask for them in his application. To qualify for a line of duty disability pension, Mr. Hull must prove that he suffers from a sickness, accident, or injury incurred in or resulting from the performance of an active duty. And the pension code clearly defines an active duty as any act of police duty inherently involving special risk, not ordinarily assumed by a citizen in the ordinary walks of life. Now, this is not the case here, and you heard her testimony to this very fact. Mr. Hull was on regular patrol. He pulled into traffic when he was struck by another driver coming from his left. The case law has been very clear. And when an officer suffers from an injury that was not necessarily triggered or resulting from the performance of a specific and identifiable act of police duty involving special risk, a line of duty pension will not be granted. This special risk doctrine was discussed just last month by the appellate court in Griffin versus the Village of New Lenox Police Pension Fund. In that case, an officer tripped off of a curb while leaving a courthouse where he had just testified before a grand jury. An action taken by police officers on a regular occasion. Now, no special risk was found for this activity, which the court felt was not applicable to any positional risk theory, placing him there, or specifically placing him in his location as a result of his job duties. The court felt that an officer must be doing something more simply than being on duty to qualify for an on-duty pension, and that an active duty should not be confused with merely being on duty. Same is the case here. The First District Appellate Court, ruling in favor of the Oak Lawn Police Pension Fund in the matter of Miller versus the Board of Trustees of the Oak Lawn Police Pension Fund, in 2019, reviewed an officer's claim for PTSD related to years of police work. The board and the court disagreed. The line of cases continues in this area. In Anderson v. Village of Maywood in 2013, the court held that a police officer is not entitled to a line of duty disability pension where the medical evidence shows that no specific act performed by the officer during his police service causes disability. The board and the court denied his application, this officer's application for a line of duty pension. The list goes on. Poulos versus Board of Trustees for the City of Waukegan Police Pension Fund, Williamson versus the Board of Trustees of the City of Springfield, and Kern v. Board of Trustees for the St. Charles Police Pension Fund. The court in all of these cases came to the same conclusion, that if there is no specific act that caused the condition, the officer should not receive a line of duty pension. Similarly here, Mr. Hall's alleged psychiatric conditions are not related to his work accident. The doctors agree. His psychiatric symptoms are a result of his termination. And you have no other records for the last 2 years to combat that opinion. And even if you find that it is related to some specific act while on duty, there is absolutely no specific and identifiable act of police duty involving special risk and can be identified here. Mr. Hall, while on standard patrol, pulled into an intersection and was hit by another driver. Whether or not the other driver was under the influence of alcohol or not, there's no mention. Therefore, he should not receive a line of duty pension for this fact. Mr. Hall has shown to us, both through his testimony today and in the medical history in this matter, that his current condition is not related to his work accident. He has shown us that he can work in a light duty capacity in South Barrington without accommodations. He has shown us that he can coach a high school football team to a state championship in a crowded stadium without accommodations. He tells his doctors that he is depressed because he cannot return to work, but then tells other doctors that he is not depressed. But then he turns around and tells Chief Dunn that he has no interest in any accommodations or a light duty position with the village. He picks and chooses the statements he wants to make. Some of his own doctors, the village's expert, and the board's examining doctors have denied that his current conditions are a result of the accident. Based on all of this evidence, we ask that you deny Mr. Hall's application for a disability pension, both line of duty and non-line of duty. If in fact the board finds that he is disabled, the evidence does not even come close to establishing that the disability is related to an active duty. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Rebuttal?
Yes. Just a few points. First of all, counsel notes that Dr. Seno referred Officer Hall to Dr. Domenico shortly after that initial appointment date. And at that time, it was not approved. He could not schedule an appointment with Dr. Domenico. He attempted to do that, and it was not approved. With respect to Dr. Brighting offering an opinion that Officer Hall's depression was due to a termination, again, the timeline is Dr. Brighting did the evaluations in February of 2018, which is almost a year prior to the termination. And at that particular time, there have been no indications that Officer Hall was going to be terminated from his position. Now, counsel also brought up Dr. Deutsch's report and points out that on page 720, Dr. Deutsch writes in his report that Officer Hall says that his dizziness and nauseous resolved. And I'll read the sentence for you because I questioned that as well. It reads, quote, "He was getting dizzy and nauseous, but does symptoms resolve?" That's the statement. That's what is typed in there. But if you go further in his report on page 722, in answer to question number 7, there's a sentence that says Stephen Hall does not feel he can return to work because of ongoing headaches and dizziness complaints. So which one is it? Is it the first statement that his dizziness and headaches have resolved? Or is it later on in the report, he related that his dizziness and headaches have continued? There's a statement counsel made with respect to, I believe, Dr. Massoud saying that the diagnosis is chronic migraine. Again, look at the medical records. There is no reference to Officer Hall suffering from migraine headaches at any time prior to the motor vehicle accident. These are headaches that resulted from the traumatic brain injury. With respect to the PETA statute, and counsel read the actual statute, the word employed is utilized. You forfeit your PETA benefits if you are employed by another entity, whether with or without pay. Employed. Officer Hull was not employed by the Cary School District. He volunteered his services to the football team. Again, when you look at the entire medical record presented in evidence, you'll see that the depression began long before the termination. Dr. Dinwiddie's statement that the depression occurred after the termination is clearly not accurate. With respect to that meeting again in November of 2018 with the chief in the village, the most recent doctor's note is Dr. Hunnicky from September saying he's unfit for work of any kind until he gets the treatment. I don't even understand why they would have had that meeting to suggest accommodations when the most recent medical report they received says Officer Hull can't work at all. With respect to active duty, counsel again alluded to or cited to various cases, and I'm familiar with some of those cases, and many of those cases deal with a circumstance not where the officer is driving a squad car on routine patrol, but more walking to a vehicle, walking out of a courtroom, doing administrative type work. I have the case of Rose versus Mount Prospect. The court cites a Jones case, and here's what they say. In Jones, the court concluded that there were special risks associated with routine patrol, namely being prepared to respond to citizens' requests, controlling and regulating traffic, maintaining constant vigilance, which were not those that would be encountered by ordinary citizens. Therefore, the officer was performing an act of duty when he was injured, even though the act itself involved merely driving a vehicle. And what the Supreme Court has said in multiple cases and the appellate court has followed is you do not look at the actual activity that caused the injury. You look at what was the officer actually performing at the time of the injury. For example, he's performing patrol duties, or he's affecting something else, not administratively, not driving back to the police station in one case where he dropped off a subpoena and he was a passenger in the vehicle. If you are an officer in a squad car on routine patrol, the courts have consistently stated that alone is not a risk that the general public is exposed to. It is a risk inherent to a police officer because they have to be vigilant at all times while operating that vehicle on the streets of that municipality. Clearly, this was an act of duty. He was performing that routine patrol at the time that he was struck by that other driver. And I think the records are clear that the individual was charged with driving while intoxicated. And that's a special risk, working late at night as a police officer, that the ordinary public is not exposed to at the same degree because they don't drive 8 hours a day in that type of traffic at those particular times of the day where certainly there is a greater risk to be exposed to drunken driving violations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I expect at this time the pension board will want to deliberate in closed session. If that's what it wants to do, it needs a motion to go into closed session pursuant to Section 2C4 of the Open Meetings Act.
So moved.
Motion by Keith. Second by Joe. Your roll call.
Yes, sir.
Keith?
Yes.
Joe? Yes. Michael?
Yes.
Tony?
Yes.
And I'm also in favor.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much. Yeah, of course, we're going to go in that room in the back there.
Very good.
Thank you.
Everything is exploded. She says just too much. Oh, that she is. You know, it's a lot. I think she like works most of her stuff, but bought it like 2 days ago. Nutrition. Oh, okay, so I bought the salmon and I bought the lamb. don't wanna. Yeah, that's a good idea, because I noticed like when I open close Gen Chapter, there's nothing there, even though the door is closed. Right. No, I'm talking about my house, that's what I'm saying, so if you have in there, they have in, yeah, in the bathroom too. You know? Even though the closet door is closed, there's still little gaps, I mean, yeah. Oh, my heels, man, I would put my toes or, the one foot is not, one of the big ones for the wife. Oh. Beautiful sunshine here today. Looks like, we're gonna get overcast by 1 o'clock, but right now it's beautiful. We'll get like partly cloudy by 1 o'clock and then like 4 o'clock. Uh, more or less, but, you know, I'm gonna, I want to use the carpet shampooer, but I will do what I don't wanna do first. Very smart for the younger sister. Right? Yeah. Have you ever seen Jenna and Barbara Bush in an interview together? They're hilarious. They are hilarious. They are like two completely different people. And I guess Jenna is the younger one. You know, yeah, Jenna's the one that came up second. Yeah, no. And Barbara, you're Jenna. Really good. Yeah, she Oh, George. He's a very nice man. Whatever you think of his politics, he's somebody that you could like have lunch with, have over for a barbecue. I mean, he's just a very likable guy. Oh, you did? Is he any good? In the book he says that. When he was at the what? Oh, that's right, at the work thing. Yeah. Which one? I've gotten on a few. Oh, I've got the perfect thing for you. What I got Tommy, yeah. It originated in Japan, but now all the bath stores here have it. It looks like a piece. You know what the material of those exfoliating gloves are made from? But it's like this really long rectangle of the same material. And you put it, you kind of do a crisscross, like your left hand low and your right hand high, and you kind of, oh, Bed Bath & Beyond has it. I had heard a bunch in the country were closing down. I think they were trying to, close the less, profitable stores, but you can order them online. I mean, they're, shower back exfoliator or something like that. But I also use, the other thing I got them, the typical back brush, but it has an arch in it. Yeah, now that's if you want to like do a little bit of a massage or lymphatic, get the stimulation of the lymphatic system going a little bit. No, it's not going to scrub. It's just going to feel good. It's just going to feel good. But if you want to scrub it, you want exfoliation, then you want that I tell you, the Japanese, their bath system, they've got all the tools for fabulous bath time. Yes. That's a little high, I think, expensive for that. Are they supposed to? Maybe they are that much. I don't know. I think like $6 is a more appropriate price. What? Oh, poor Hildegard. What did she do now? Yeah, it's like a right. It's like, don't you have those gloves that are like exfoliate that you put on your hands in the shower? And they're kind of, even Walmart has them. No, Hildy, no. No, Hildy, no. Yeah, I have a more commanding presence when I'm in the room instead of, FaceTime or speakerphone or. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Go potty, Reggie. Hurry up. Go potty. Well, she's got cabin fever like the rest of us, you know. I mean. She's a baby. She's doing teething, you. She's teething. So when does she get through the teething phase? She's a baby shark with all those teeth. You need to give her one of those rings, one of those teething rings, so she's not using your body to fight. Yeah. Don't they have dog teething rings? She still prefers to bite you? Oh. You think she's just being a rebel? She's trying to provoke you to take her outside to the dog park. Well, the temperature, it's getting up there by you now. It's up to what, 18 degrees by you? Ugh. What percentage of things do you buy online compared to in a store? I'm just curious. Well, yeah, especially with the pandemic, but I'm thinking you're becoming a regular Ann Trincher. Yeah. So does Hildy bark as much when they come to your door as when they're across the street, or is she? Okay. So did you put her in her crate? Oh my goodness. That's amazing. She is. Yeah. We love our Hildegard. Yeah, they have an Amazon return center at every Kohl's, I think. They've had it out here for years. I beg your pardon? Right. No, you have to go to their customer service counter and return it. They have a special line for Amazon returns and another one for Kohl's returns. All just in the moments we've been on the phone, you ordered that much for your checking boxes? Oh. Huh. Yeah. Insoles for your boots or for the dog or for you? Okay. Human boots or dog boots? Ah. Oh, they're going nuts now because they know I'm cooking them hamburger. Nancy's doing her business. What's going on, honey? Oh, there we go. Well, she went where I was literally in the middle of changing the pee pad, and when I picked it up, she went there. Like, oh gosh. What did you do, sweetie? You're supposed to do this outside. Okay, where's the enzyme spray? She looks terribly fascinated as she watches me clean it up. I would blame it on myself, but the only thing I've ever done is once before she dropped a poop, I was able to pick her up and carry her outside. But I didn't yell at her. Cause, you know, it's my fault if they, you know, I gotta get them out, and if there's an accident in the house. They're just little creatures. They gotta go, they gotta go. So, oh, here's the garbage. Here we go. So I think it's just J Bosco or Yahoo. I know. I just always just send it to J Bosco or Yahoo. Or a copy and then something send you. J Bosco 1180.
Mm-hmm. Did they not fit or what happened?
Mm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How are your other boots holding up? Yeah. Well, now might be the time, you know, it might be clearance time now. Yeah. Wait till she's not a puppy anymore. Just right through this winter, yeah. Yeah. My dog ate my boots. There you go. That's the return reason. Not. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Fuzz remover. Send me a link to that. Nice. Well, I just think that's gonna make your feet stink. But I guess everything's fleece. You can't get wool anymore, so yeah. I mean, didn't you buy something for Joe's? Or was it wool, the shearling kind? Oh, you returned it. Because I thought it would be fun, but then I realized it was a Saturday. But you should go. It would be so fun to make. Well, yeah, I know. I thought it. Well, at the time, I didn't really. Yeah, I wasn't thinking it was a Saturday. I thought it was a Sunday. Usually, those things are on a Sunday. But well, maybe you can go with the ladies. She's not into that, huh? Homemade maple syrup. Oh yeah. Right, because of her.
Right, the cancer thing, yeah. That'll do it. Am I? I was just trying, I just thought it would be a good thing to, it would be fun, it's like, it's kind of matching your kitchen cooking theme that you're kind of into lately, and, yes. But the Potawatomi out here always does it on a Sunday, so I am making ground beef right now. And I picked up poop. And that's what I'm doing right now. But that's coming. I'm gonna feed myself first before I do that. Who posted that? Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess everyone's got their own theory on that one. There are parts of the country, like farmland, Nebraska, where, dog, you never let a dog in the house, like a outside animal. Shelters around and hay and stuff like that, but yeah, I would not comment. Actually, silence is often the best. When no one responds to it, I always feel like a jerk when no one responds to something I post. Yeah. So, I mean, it could just be that people are busy or whatever, depending on what's going on in the world, but total silence usually means, maybe not the best thing to post, yeah. Oh. Well, that's, oh, it is. Fabulous. Is she? Yeah. Oh, she's just. Oh, did I? Maybe I did. I thought it was mine. I'm sorry. I don't think I mean, if I did it on a prior visit, but I always have pulleys in my house, but I think I bought some. No, I bought some when I was there. I'm so sorry, Jody. Did I? I know. Maybe I did. I have no idea. I usually put everything back in that cabinet above. No. I put everything back in the cabinet to the upper right of the stovetop. That's where all the medicine goes. But if it was downstairs in my bathroom, I may have, because I would have thought it was mine then. Because usually when you give me something, it's in the kitchen, I put it back in the thing, the cabinet to the upper right of the stove. Uh-oh. That's embarrassing. She's a baby. She's a German Shepherd baby. Does she know she's a German Shepherd? Maybe Maybe she thinks she's a toy poodle. Or she's just a baby. Great. Yeah. Just yeah, she's still a child. You know.
We will at the very end.
What happened? I wonder if my thing just ran out of power. My laptop. Let me check this out. I don't know if the screen went dark or because they having technical issues or if they're messing around here and trying to keep me from seeing the verdict. Hang on a minute. Oh yeah. Because you gotta log into the webinar. It's like a webinar thing. Come on. I heard their voices start like they were reconvening. And then suddenly the whole computer went dark. Come on. What's going on here? Okay. Why did that happen? Hang on a minute. Oh, for crying out loud. Hang on a minute, look at this. I heard their voices and then they disappeared. Okay. Okay, yes. I had plenty of power. They just cut it off.
We need a motion to return to open session.
So moved.
Motion by Keith,
Second.
second by Michael. Roll call, Keith.
Yes.
Joe? Yes. Michael?
Yes.
Tony?
Yes.
And I'm in favor as well.
Okay. All right, the pension board is deliberating in closed session pursuant to section 2C4 of the Open Meetings Act. All right. Is there a motion to grant Stephen Hall's application for a line of duty disability pension based on a neurological condition?
So moved. Second.
Motion by Keith, second by Michael. Roll call. Keith?
No.
Joe? No. Michael?
No.
Tony?
Yes.
And I'm a no.
I can't believe that.
Is there a motion to grant Stephen Hall's application for a not on duty disability pension based on a neurological condition?
So moved.
Second.
Motion by Joe, second by Keith. Roll call. Keith?
No.
Joe? No. Michael?
No.
Tony?
Yes.
It's almost over.
And I am a no.
It's over.
Is there a motion with respect to Stephen Hall's application for a line of duty disability pension based on a psychiatric condition?
So moved. Second.
Motion by Keith, second by Michael. Roll call. Keith?
No.
Joe? No. Michael?
No.
Tony?
Yes.
And I am a no.
Is there a motion with respect to Stephen Hall's application for a not on duty disability pension based on a psychiatric conditions?
So moved. Motion by Joe,
Second.
second by Keith. Roll call. Keith?
Yes.
Joe? Yes. Michael?
Yes.
Tony?
Yes.
And I'm also in favor.
So the pension board has granted the application for a not on duty disability pension based on a psychiatric condition. That's going to be based on the salary attached to rank on the date of removal from payroll, based on 50% of that amount. Based on the record, we have the date of removal from payroll as of November 2nd, 2018, and a salary attached to rank of $78,145. And we'll verify those numbers with the village pursuant to section, I believe it's 3-141.1, Mr. Viglioli.
November of 28, because he was terminated.
Yeah, I believe that's when he was actually removed from payroll, and then he was not getting paid from that date forward until he was terminated in 2019. Pension board will prepare a written decision in order that will become the final administrative decision for purposes of the administrative review law. We'll get that together. The pension board next meets in April. So I would expect we'll have that on the agenda for approval at the April meeting, and then copies of the pension board's written decision will be forwarded to both parties at that time for purposes of any administrative review that the parties may wish to seek. And then pursuant to section 3-115 of the pension code, the applicant is required to undergo medical examinations at least annually to determine whether he remains disabled or whether he's recovered from disability. Mr. Figlioli, do you and your client understand the annual examination process? Okay. And also, just in case your client moves out of state, the pension board can require him to come back into state to undergo a medical examination. Do you agree? Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other questions from the village?
No, thank you very much.
Any questions from the applicant?
We have no question.
All right, then you just need a motion to adjourn.
Public comment? Or adjourn from the hearing?
Adjourn the hearing, then we'll do public comments. Actually, how about we just do this? We're going to go off the record, and then we'll take public comments, and then we'll adjourn the meeting in its entirety. So off the record with respect to the disability hearing. Thank you.
Public comments in the Zoom app, go ahead and raise your hand. If you're dialed in, please dial *9 to raise your hand. There's one with their hand raised. Go ahead. You're going to have 4 minutes for public comment. And
Hello?
you have 4 minutes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, I have been videotaping all of this and all of these proceedings, and I just will say that it's not exactly something I could use for recruiting police applicants. I am particularly dismayed by former Chief McIsaac's misleading, really, the public when he brought up the positive for opioid. If he was a chief of a department, I think that he would have paid closer attention to all of the records and known that he was admitted to the hospital when he tested positive and was administered it by hospital personnel. And so this leads me to a bigger question. If you missed that, what else did you not read in the records? As I've said before, our village has a huge financial crisis going on right now, and I believe that this is a political pressure, this vote against Officer Hall, who clearly was injured in the line of duty. They had to pull him out with the jaws of life. I'm appalled. I am absolutely appalled after hearing all the testimony. The village is entering a deficit, and a huge deficit and in spending. And I just think that this is just, Officer Hull is suffering the consequences of village manager Svandilis's spend policies, and the elected officials who give him carte blanche to spend as he chooses on their pet projects. And I think that employees are suffering, and I think that we will become a pariah amongst those who apply through the Blue Line website. My sources at the Blue Line website say that we have very few applicants check the box for Wheeling, even though we are the top 3 salary of the different municipalities on that website. And I think this is largely because of it, because who wants to enter a life of, oppression? This is horrific. What kind of a people deny a clear line of duty disability? He was hit in the line of duty. I'm just appalled. And I think that the clear prejudice against anything psychological, I've already proven that. I think that McIsaac has always been a company man, and I think he voted the way that Spondylis wanted him to. I think he was just a puppet. After I exposed Benson, who is not suitable because of his integrity issues, spending money out of the police benevolence fund to decorate the police station, and his clear emails with his hatred and contempt for anybody with a psychiatric disorder. I'm just appalled. I am profoundly saddened. I thought after hearing the testimony that I did, that for sure you would vote to grant this young man, and I'm just very concerned for the people of Wheeling who are now going to be subject to law enforcement, who are making decisions not based on the letter of the law, but based on whether or not Spondylis and the elected officials of the board are going to appreciate that. No one's going to want to work for us. I'm horrified, and this is a dark day in Wheeling's history. And
Your 4 minutes are up.
Shame on you, Mr. McIsaac, for misleading the group.
Is there any other public comment? Please raise your hand now. Not seeing any further public comments. Entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved. Second.
Motion by Joe, second by Keith. Roll call. Keith.
Yes.
Joe.
Yes.
Michael.
Yes.
Tony.
Yes.
And I'm in favor.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.